All right, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Tom Derrick, Senior Vice President with OpenMarkets, and I am excited to be joined today by Michael Schiller, Senior Director of Supply Chain Management with ARM, and Edward Hernandez, founding partner of Covalesce. Gentlemen, thank you for your time and lending your expertise to us today. One last sort of housekeeping here. Mike and I are here in downtown Chicago at the ARM offices, and quite coincidentally, we are next to a construction site. We're not building a hospital next door, but we are building another one of those big downtown Chicago skyscrapers. So any kind of construction noise you hear in the background, please know that's planned, and that's aesthetics to help set the tone for this construction and planning-centric web broadcast here. So, Edward, I hope we're not bringing you any flashbacks from the loud pounding if it comes through.
No, not quite. I'm used to it.
All right, guys. And I'm sure a lot of our audience is here as well, too. So let's talk quickly about sort of the purpose of today's 50-minute web broadcast. We want everyone here to gain some insight into the expertise that Edward and Mike have into the capital equipment trends and the leading practices for capital projects. These two individuals have a combined 45 years of experience leading capital procurement and planning strategies in dozens of different projects. Mike led a very significant project here in Chicago for the Lurie Children's Hospital, and we'll spend some time talking about the lessons learned from that project. But to get to Mike, we're actually going to get a more general overview of the lay of the land from Covalesce and from Edward and his experience working with dozens of projects and dozens of different hospitals nationwide. What I want to walk away here with is three different things. I'm optimistic the audience here is going to find some cool stats and trends that are going to help you to better understand the market landscape for healthcare equipment and capital projects. Edward's going to dive into some construction-specific things that are going to make you a little bit smarter in how you work with your colleagues and understand the challenges we all face in capital construction projects. And then we're going to get some great pinpoint lessons from Mike from the nearly $1 billion construction project here in downtown Chicago. So once again, thank you, Mike. Thank you, ARM. Thank you, Edward. And thank you to Covalesce. So, guys, I'm going to put you on the spot here real quick before we begin. And Edward, ask you to just give us, the 30-second speech on your background and a little bit about Covalesce and your firm there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. So, Covalesce is a diverse healthcare consulting firm with practices around program management, medical equipment planning, transition activation, and technology planning for healthcare environments. I'm actually a clinician by education with a background in respiratory care, and I have been in this field of planning in healthcare environments for a little more than 25 years. And I've had the opportunity to work on a diverse array of projects ranging from small military clinics all the way up to $1.5 billion scale projects in major metropolitan areas. So I've seen the gamut, so to speak, when it comes to the planning and the procurement and the implementation of healthcare projects, and I'm hoping to share just some insights with the attendees to better arm them with information as they navigate that landscape going forward.
Edward, that's a nice little transition there with we'll arm them with better landscape. Let's turn to the ARM expert here. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Edward. So I've got healthcare supply chain experience working at Lurie Children's in various supply chain technology and project management leadership. Prior to that, I worked at Baxter and Letterly Laboratories, a pharmaceutical manufacturer. Been with ARM now just about 3 years, subject matter expert for all things supply chain for the association. Our association represents supply chain professionals across the entire health ecosystem. So that's providers, suppliers, TPO communities. Our membership is about 4,500 members now. Actually, we've eclipsed the 4,500 member mark, and we've got 32 or 33 chapters, regional chapters across the U.S. So a growing association, and I'm really excited, Tom, to be here. And Edward, it's great to reconnect with you and talk a little bit about the project.
All right, everyone. Thanks. This is Tom again. If I could just make one more reminder there.
Thank you
for unmute for us. Not
back to you. So I don't know. Like,
we would broke it on.
The chief has title paragraph.
Yeah, I don't. Besides that, I can't find anywhere that makes sense.
Okay, folks. Hi.
They're talking about
Before we get sort of involved, I want to talk to you. Well,
instead of that, I was thinking the only way to do that is to say
the first thing I want to focus on here is on the
they
left.
have an expert staff, and that's
Believe it or not,
financial. What is it? So financial is
market largest, most closely recognized. Open markets research done with LEK, which is a consulting firm here in Chicago. It's actually showing that the capital market is between 70 and 80 billion.
Mute your phone.
Thank you. Nice job. Okay, so everyone, let's take a quick other stat here. So to sort of lay the landscape for today's session, I want to talk about the U.S. hospital capital spending. So research conducted by LEK Consulting and Open Markets is showing that the actual capital spending domestic is a lot bigger than most organizations realize. That between 70 and 80 billion dollars worth of capital expenses are incurred by health systems nationwide every single year. So take a look at that breakdown there. About half of that is construction. Mike and Edward, you know what that is better than I do. You know, you're talking your bricks and mortars, the building, the actual, you know, the construction-related part of your capital spend. Smaller than I expect and smaller than I think others realize is that the IT equipment is only $6 billion. I think a lot of that might be due to sort of the shift to the cloud and the operational accounting things that relate to, say, your Epic spend or other software as a service expenses. But then down at the very bottom, healthcare equipment is $30 billion nationwide on an annual basis. That's a lot bigger than people realize. $30 billion worth of capital is bought and sold in the United States year to health systems. We can break that down a little bit more there. You see some nomenclature that Open Markets is about non-clinical equipment, so your patient or sort of your furniture and fixtures and things that go in there. That's about 14% of that $30 billion. Your non-differentiated spend, that's your wheelchairs and your IV poles. That's another $4 billion worth of spend every year on things like IV poles and wheelchairs. That's an awful lot of capital. Really would have thought of it commodity expenses, but that's a big pot. Routine use equipment, stuff that's used every day, maybe your patient transports, your bed. That's a big chunk of your capital equipment, 26%, $8 billion nationwide. Everybody is expecting that. Specialty and narrow use is another 14% of your capital spend every year. Now, Open Markets defines that as singularly used clinical items, like a bladder scanner or a neonatal incubator. Things that supply chain professionals are really, well-versed on, know how to negotiate, know what to expect, and that needs some influence from clinicians, but for the most part, it's a really, what you're buying. And then you've got your high cost and your technical goods, which account for 32% of all capital spending. That's your MRIs, your CTs, your big complex capital equipment projects. And those are the ones that really help to drive up SG&A that we see there in the center column. This is a number that is surprising to me every time I see it and every time we speak with our supplier and provider partners, that it's really expensive to sell the hospital. I think about this from both points of view. It's really hard for supply chain leaders to buy equipment. You've got to have influence from your clinicians. You've got to have approval from finance for the dollars. You've got to have biomed review, IT review. There's just a lot of things that need to be done to get a new MRI or even a new bladder scanner brought into a building. Well, all of that process and all of that, complexity results in a high cost of sale for the equipment supplier community. Some of our suppliers that are out there can be very transparent about the fact that they don't actually know who they need to talk to at a healthcare organization to find out if the budget's been approved. They oftentimes have trouble finding out, who do I need to talk to? Who's an influencer? Who's a decision maker? Things that the provider community doesn't always recognize that, hey, you know what? If I spend an hour with you and the rep is spending 2 hours in Panera waiting to talk to a doctor, well, that's half their day. That actually contributes to a high cost of sale, and in the end, contributes to a higher cost of equipment. So I bring this up here because I really want everybody to recognize that, the problems that we face as buyers and sellers of healthcare equipment are much the same. Dealing with a lot of stakeholders, dealing with problems of transparency and access, and that it's going to take a collaborative effort on the part of buyers and sellers to drive the SG&A down, which is the key to making our capital dollars in the hospital go further. And the last thing I want to say is a general capital equipment stat and trend here is that deep research done by the LEK Group, as well as by Eugene Schneller of Arizona State on behalf of GPOs, has actually shown evidence that the GPOs do a lot of great things, but capital equipment isn't necessarily something that providers see as a core strength of the GPO portfolio, and that only 36% of all capital transactions are completed with the assistance of GPO pricing and contracts. Lastly, here's a stat that our friends at LEK put forward, is that 64% of providers deem their current benchmarking solutions to be inadequate. Now, that surprised me a bit because we know some of the great things that ECRI and MD Byline do, but it's interesting to me that, and telling, that it makes me think that the healthcare provider community is looking for a new way to get data and access to best practices for capital equipment services. So I want to leave these stats here. These things will be available in the download, but I hope this sort of sets the stage for our subject matter experts to dive into capital construction projects and trends. So Edward, let me pass it along to you here. I'm going to ask you to sort of quickly tell us a little bit more about Covalus and some of these projects you all have done.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, I want to thank the participants today, and what I wanted to impress upon you here is that, and this is kind of a running joke between the three of us, is that if you've seen a hospital, you've seen a hospital. And the graphics that I'm showing you here, the photos, are that in each one of these organizations, which you would consider these to be fairly prestigious organizations, is that they each have their subtle nuances as it pertains to project procurement and how they navigate the landscape for acquiring assets to support a project. And our experience is that at each client site, we always experience some level of differentiation that I think the participants here need to understand, is that when you are navigating a project and you want to try, you want to make sure that you are leveraging as much of your internal processes as possible to be efficient from a project delivery perspective. But there are going to be what I consider disruptive activities to those standard processes that need to be taken into consideration very early on as you're developing the plan to execute the project. And so this is just an example of, and we're going to talk more about the project that most of you may have seen or are familiar with, and that's the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago later on in the presentation. But my intent here is to share with you that whether it is a privately held organization, whether it's an academic medical center or it's military healthcare, for-profit, not-for-profit, each one of those organizations will impress upon the service providers that we do it a certain way, and it's done this way because it's the way we've been doing it. And so I just wanted to share with you that information. The next slide is intended to impress upon you what has transpired over the years with just the actual cost of a healthcare construction project and what we're seeing the trends in the industry. And if I go back to the mid-90s, you know, when design and construction was taking place, we had relatively nominal dollar figures when it came to the what I consider the movable asset side of a project. And as time has continued to pass and technology has continued to evolve, we continue to see the level of complexity and sophistication required inside these healthcare environments increase. And with that level of sophistication in how things are executed inside a project, we see these cost elements increase dramatically. It is not uncommon in today's market for organizations and for healthcare owners to be facing projects that are budgeted very close to or breaking the $1,000 per square foot cost when it comes to forecasting a project in its totality. And we're seeing that the carve out for medical equipment and IT and furnishing to continue to consume a larger portion of the overall percentage of a project. To give you an example, we're actually in the very early stages here at Penn Medicine in Philadelphia, and the FF&E medical equipment and the technology, IT low voltage, along with furniture, is close to a complete 45% of the total project cost. So the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is really to reinforce that there's a significant investment when it comes to the outfitting of these projects, and we're seeing that it's very important for owners to start taking a harder look at how they're going to execute this very early on in the project rather than waiting till later on in the timeline.
Hey, Edward, this is Tom here. That $1,000 per square foot got Mike and I both, you know, piqued our interest there. I didn't realize that cost was so high. Can you tell me in an estimate what you think it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago?
Yeah, so, you know, usually, well, I can tell you historically, back in the mid-90s, when we saw a project that was creeping towards $400 a square foot, we were concerned that the equipment and or some of the softer assets would be considered a poison pill for the project. And if you think about even prior to the mid-90s, and I can tell you and I'm dating myself here, but in the late 80s, when most facilities were being designed with a hub and spoke sort of design, you didn't have what I consider disruptive technologies that had to be implemented in the space. Let's go far enough back to think about the implementation of the CT scanner, the GE 8800 that was rolled out in the mid to late 80s. That was a phenomenal event in how it caused the healthcare design community to take a step back and start to integrate these very complex systems from a mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and low voltage perspective. And so it exponentially caused an increase in requirements, infrastructure requirements, which in turn started to drive up the actual cost of construction. And today's market, when you're seeing, per this graph, when you're seeing things close to the $800 per square foot mark, that's not uncommon. That's not an uncommon event. And I will tell you that with what is happening from a healthcare delivery standpoint and organizations trying to decant their campuses or decant their buildings by delineating the patient population, where you've got most of your outpatient activities taking place in another location, and you want to create this very high-end acute care environment. That high-end acute care environment has a significant cost element to it. So just some fundamentals for everyone to maybe as a takeaway. You know, at the beginning of a project, and for those who are online and are navigating a project today, it's very, very important around the, let's just say, the medical equipment component, that early on in the design process, that a carve-out is set up where a team of individuals such as, you know, supply chain management, biomedical engineering, clinical engineering, other clinical stakeholders sit down and actually define some objectives around the goals around how are we going to implement and procure the technology that's required for these spaces. So the organization of that needs to take place as early as possible in the design process and in the selection process, as to avoid any delays, which delays in turn cost money. And the number one objective here is to make sure that you're creating a process that creates efficiency, and you're leveraging the processes that you can internally to help facilitate a very streamlined approach to the planning, procurement, and implementation of the assets required in a project. So what I would recommend is that you definitely want to sit down and establish an algorithm and a structure for anything along the lines of how your bid process is going to work, how your specification process is going to work, and more importantly, how your procurement process is going to work. One of the things that I would impress upon everyone here again is that decision-making trees are extremely important because in some instances you can have a very streamlined approach to where a budget is approved and you have certain thresholds that allow for approvals in an efficient manner. And I think it's important to make sure that everyone understands what happens if you start to cross that threshold and have to take another approach. So identifying those objectives, establishing an organization with who the team is and the roles and responsibilities, making sure you understand the algorithm around planning and execution, and then making sure that you have the right decision tree in place, I think ultimately creates a better outcome for the project and for the team as a whole. So one of the early on due diligence or discovery components to a project is that every project has an impact on the overall organization, regardless of size and regardless of timing. Organizations that have a solid strategic business plan along with a solid facility master plan needs to be augmented with a really good equipment plan. And the reason I'm saying this is that during a strategic business plan development, you're going to start to define certain things that the organization does today that needs to be embellished, or new service lines that they're not offering today but are going to be implemented in the future. Those desires always have an impact on the actual facility master plan, which in turn has a huge impact on your capital equipment plan. So that they're symbiotic in nature. You can't do one without the other. So sharing this early on and outside of the actual project helps the service providers understand how you're going to influence the decisions for a certain project. So anytime you're sitting down with your consultants, anytime you have an opportunity to engage consultants to assist you in these types of projects, I think it's very important to be sure that you share this level of detail so they have line of sight and understand how your organization is looking at near-term and long-term decisions as part of their overall business plan. Developing the budget. This is something that I know Mike has a distinct experience in doing this. We do this for every organization that we work with. But what's important here is, again, understanding the owner's goals and the organization. What are some of those strategic initiatives that I mentioned earlier in that Venn diagram? How will those strategic initiatives influence this project holistically? And then, once you get to that point, what is the organization's policy or stance on the reuse of existing assets. I can tell you that on the Lurie Children's Project, we had a significant goal on the reuse component. It was a significant percentage, which in turn has an impact on operations and has an impact on activation. And ultimately, the reuse of existing assets can have a significant impact on the outcome of your actual budget. Another important influencer is what type of standardization initiatives does the organization have in place, and how will those be implemented as part of a project, or, for example, here at Penn Medicine, this project is of a significant magnitude to where the organization is wanting to leverage this project to allow them to take a step back and look at where can we improve on some of our standardization by maybe even going a different direction with certain modalities. And then, of course, always with the budget, a budget is never very useful if it's crafted in a manner that is presented to the owner in a list price fashion. So how can the GPO affiliation or master agreements that the organization uses on a daily basis influence the development of that budget? You want to be able to provide the owner a set of numbers that is realistic, but yet doesn't put the project in a position of having to recalibrate or relook at dollar values as you're going through the supply chain process. But more importantly, how can you make sure that at the end of the day, when the project is complete, your variance is to the point where it has actually provided the organization some sort of savings from the overall process.
Hey, Edward, excellent set of leading practices there. We can tell that's quite a bit of use cases and experience go into some of that thought there, so I appreciate it. A couple things that jumped out at me there. Heavy emphasis on planning. Do your work ahead of time. A couple common themes in there about transparency and really figuring out your internal and external collaboration and communication strategy.
Absolutely.
So let's turn it over a bit here to Mike and hear how your direct experience from Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago came about. So give us the background.
Sure. Well, this was an amazing project, and I have to say we had just a phenomenal project team that was put together by the organization, from construction management to the building and load team, equipment planners that we worked with. I'm sure I'm forgetting others, and certainly, of course, the operational stakeholders. So I can tell you that is probably one of the most important fundamental or foundational aspects, is putting together the right team and creating that environment of transparency, as Edward and Tom have mentioned, and collaboration and the ability to work together. I'm going to tell you, they call these once-in-a-lifetime projects because for most of us, you do it once and you're not sure you ever want to do it again. So it's a high-pressure, just a high-pressure situation that you're really working in. I would say from day one, it really doesn't let down even after go-live. So fundamentally, you really have to have a good team, and that was something that we had at Lurie Children's. Again, just a great team that was compiled for the project. So it's just some of the things that I want to cover today. What way is the best way for your organization to plan for the capital equipment? How do you want to manage your supplier relationships? How do you want to manage the RFP process? Who are the stakeholders that you need to be bringing around for each of the procurement categories? So those are just some of the highlights that I want to touch on here, and we'll go into some more detail as we progress through the slide deck here. So Edward had mentioned subtle nuances. So a couple of the subtle nuances for our hospital really is that it's a high-rise hospital, and a hospital within an urban construction setting. We had a second-floor ED. I don't know that there's too many hospitals that can boast an emergency department on the second floor, but again, based on the footprint that we had and a high-rise hospital in an urban setting, That was one of the nuances, the subtle nuances to our project. And it was handled with dedicated elevators from the ground level through the ambulance bay right up to the second floor ED. We had a receiving dock that was configured and requirements that met the city requirements of only city-sized trucks. You couldn't have any large semis driving through the city and making deliveries. So, how the configuration of the loading dock. Some of the other, let's see, jumping into project considerations here. You need to, of course, this is a no-brainer. Time and risk equal money. So you need to be managing this risk, and you need to strike that balance. I know we had our opening date set, and senior leadership said that date will not move. And so we all were marching, and it was important that was the kind of the driving force for the project, right? We were all marching in line to meet that opening date. You got to look at potential factors that will create delays in construction. Again, I've already mentioned construction in an urban environment with a really tight floor plate plan. And then what are the downstream impacts to the building load, to construction management? Supplier relationships play a big part in any impact to those, and really eliminating or avoiding those impacts. I can tell you that some of the things that we really put into place early on was we wanted to have the supply chain team really a critical component of the project. And really there were a number of factors that made sense. Number one, you had internal expertise with the organization and with the operation and with the stakeholders. So that as you're going through the 52 medical equipment bid categories that we had as a part of the Lurie project, you had different stakeholders associated with each one of those categories. And so who are those stakeholders? And so rather than ensuring a third party would have the proper organizational or institutional knowledge, we felt it was important that supply chain had a critical role in the project. And so that was my role really in coordinating all of those bid categories, getting the correct stakeholders. I can tell you here as we jump into some of the lessons learned is the procurement strategy. You really need to define and develop that up front. And this was something that took a lot of work. Your operation, I can tell you from experience, your operational processes fall far short of processes necessary for a construction project. And so there was a lot of work with a lot of operational stakeholders, our contracting team, our finance team, our legal team, risk management team, really to come together and define what's our procurement strategy going to be for this project. There are so many different factors that come into play with a construction site. Some of those are the job site requirements, and how do those impact the vendors? How do those impact the bid categories? You really need to work through that. I know we had, if I'm remembering correctly, it was maybe a 40-page job site requirement that our construction partners had, and it covered the gamut: safety, how you would operate within the job site, etc. Critical to a construction project, but we had to make sure that those requirements were passed on along to the vendors. So how do you effectively do that? And so again, all of this kind of rolls up into this procurement strategy. So I could tell you that right out of the gate, if you're looking at a construction project on your own, you really need to define what your procurement strategy is going to be.
Hey, Mike, question there.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about sort of sharing of those job site requirements. How many different suppliers did you work with on this project, ballpark?
Wow, that's a good question. It had to be, if I had to guess, at least 70 to 100.
So we're talking a time frame. Edward, does that sound about right?
It does sound about right, and I just want to layer something else on to Mike's comment. When you are looking at at your construction project and you're formulating your procurement strategy, don't lose sight of the fact that inside the complement of everything that is being specified or planned from a medical equipment or even sometimes a IT or low voltage perspective, the demands for certain materials or certain components early on in the project by the construction manager is invariably going to occur ahead of your timeline for when you think procurement is actually going to start. And that gets back to the fundamental of a decision-making tree, and very early on identifying, if you can or will, the items that will what I consider would be some of that disruptive, those disruptive items to your normal approach to procurement. And so that procurement strategy, you need to be thinking about how are we going to execute, let's just call it early buy items that are required by the construction manager or the general contractor as part of the overall milestone schedule from a rough end standpoint. So anything that's architecturally significant that is interfaced to the building and that has rough end requirements, don't be surprised when that surfaces as part of the timeline on the project.
So Edward, when I hear you talk about the decision tree, is that, Mike, is that part of the procurement strategy?
Absolutely. Edward brings up a good point. You've got what's called the basis of design. So before you even break ground, you go back 2 years, maybe even 3 years as you start the initial planning process for this, and you identify the different pieces of equipment, head walls, OR lights. Think of your sterilizers and your cart washers, right? So as they're starting to put together the architectural plans, there's a basis of design. 99% of the time, you fast forward 3 years, something in that piece of equipment has changed.
Right.
And so what is that process? What's your change management process? One of the situations that we were faced with early on was the cart washer. And the manufacturer that we partnered with, that was the vendor of choice, the basis of design differed from the actual design 3 years later.
Because they changed the product.
They changed the product, the configuration of the product, and in this case it was the drain.
Okay.
So they had cored a hole in the floor in one corner where the drain was previously. Now the machine had, configuration of the equipment had changed, so the drain was on the opposite side. So how do you go about compensating for that? So to Edward's point, this is where you need to have that structure in place. You don't want to define that structure at that point in time. You want to have that all determined well before you start these big categories.
So let me ask you this, Edward, you're doing, countless projects, and you must have, your decision tree and procurement strategy on your side. How much of that are you sharing with your supplier partners and early on? And I think about that sterilizer example that Mike just brought up. Is there a way in which the sharing of not only job site requirements, but of some elements of that procurement strategy can be done way in advance, 3 years before ribbon cutting, to say, hey, guys, you're going to be, if you move the drain hole, you need to give us significant notice, and, we'll don't move it. But, if you're going to move it, you need to talk about it because there's an adverse impact on our side.
So what I will tell you is that the supplier environment and the construction environment, in some way, shape, or form, are sort of like oil and water. And I don't mean that in a negative context. I just mean that the medical equipment manufacturing community operates in its let's just call it their silo as a whole, and the construction side of the equation sort of does the same thing. And oftentimes, what we see is that there's really not a communication portal or anything between those two elements, other than if you have a team that is specifically focused on the medical equipment, the low voltage, the IT, the technology component, that acts as the conduit between those two entities, because the language that one speaks versus the other, it doesn't always mesh. And so as things evolve from a device perspective with medical equipment or an enhancement, the construction manager typically looks to the planning side and the supply chain side to keep them out of harm's way. And when I say out of harm's way, to be abreast, to keep them informed and abreast of any changes that have been happening with the overall medical equipment component to the project, and that's really intended to manage risk and cost. So I don't think we've yet to find the magic wand to where changes inside a medical equipment supplier's portfolio of devices, as they do enhancements or implement enhancements or changes to their catalog. There's a certain amount of responsibility on the owner's side, along with the planning side of the equation, to make sure that they're keeping other stakeholders out of harm's way.
Edward, I think your narrative there actually is a critical factor of why the SG&A is so high, and frankly why the cost of equipment seems to be rising, because you do have these silos. The oil and water between a supplier and a healthcare organization is by definition inefficiency. And I think a little bit about low-hanging fruit, like Mike's 75 to 100 different supplier partners that he had to work with and send job site requirements off to. Is there an easier, simpler way for supply chain leadership and equipment planning leadership to work with your supplier partners? Like, if we can break down one or two communication or collaboration benefits, maybe there's a way to stop the oil and water and stop the silos. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and collaboration is a key part of that. Transparency is a key part of that, and strategic alignment. I think all of those factors help to reduce that. But again, our goal at Lurie was to have more involvement, hands-on involvement with supply chain, as opposed to turning the keys over to somebody else to run it. Some of the other real important lessons learned that I wanted to share with the group here was the terms and conditions. We defined the construction process really we boiled down our terms and conditions to 7 key articles, and those key articles went out to all of the suppliers within a bid category to respond to. If a supplier just sent us back a version that was completely redlined, we tell them, nice attempt, try again. But the bottom line was all of the suppliers within that bid category had to respond to the RFP, the 7 key articles, before they received an RFP. And really the goal here was, because we've talked about time and risk and delays, downstream impact to building load and construction. Let's not forget about training. You have what you don't want to do is make a vendor of choice decision, find out that your negotiations break down, and have to start from square one with your leading or your backup vendor of choice, right? We wanted to be at a point where every vendor was at the same point in the negotiation process. So 7 key articles went out. They had to respond. The responses had to be approved internally before that vendor received an RFP. Then the balance of the balance of the T's and C's were then incorporated within the RFP response. So it was another criteria that we evaluated when we looked at the RFP responses. And that was critical because, again, at the end of the day, we're at the same point with all of the vendors. You could have 5 vendors within one product category, and you wanted to be at the same point with all 5 of those vendors. We then had a long form and a short form that we would use depending on the big category, how complex it was. You certainly weren't going to go and use a long form T's and C's when you're buying the commodity capital items you talked about, wheelchairs, ID poles, etc. You've got a certificate of insurance. That's a whole other component that you really get into from a construction standpoint. Risk management is largely involved in that. Your contracting signature process, your spending and your volume typically is going to exceed whatever your operational process is. So what does that look like for your project? You also have your ERP processes. What's the PO, the receiver, the accounts payable process going to look like for this project? There's certain functionality limitations within some of these ERPs, or there could be functionality limitations that cause you to come up with other solutions that you're working through on that procure to pay process. You've got new vendor ads, 70 to 100 vendors that we ended up working with, but that list was much larger at the onset when you're looking at all of the vendors that you were going to initially negotiate within the bid category. So what does that process look like? Your payment terms, what are your payment terms going to be? You need to ask yourself, what's the threshold? Do we want to go with the 60-20-20 threshold? Do we want to go with an 80-20? Do we want to go 50-25-25? You need to define what that payment structure looks like for the vendors within each of these bid categories. And training, you got to think about training. You're not building just a new NICU or PICU or another acute care floor, right? You're talking about 1.25 million square foot of building that you've got equipment, a lot of it new, that all of the team, clinical team, other biomedical engineering, others need to be trained on. And so you've got to think of the volume, the timing, and how do you validate that staff have been trained on all of those different pieces of equipment. So, just some key considerations. Certainly there's more, but, time doesn't really allow for us to get into too much of the nitty-gritty. But
so you can't take a 3-year project and boil it down in 20 minutes?
No, not really, unfortunately. but project outcomes, again, I attribute this to just the phenomenal team that our senior leadership put in place, right? We opened on time. Patient move. This is a pediatric hospital. Critical. Went off amazingly. I think personally, probably the best memory I have is that night that we moved in, June 9th of 2012, standing outside the hospital, looking at that building, seeing the patient room lights on, and knowing that we were caring for patients that evening in a facility that we had all worked so hard on coordinating and getting to this point, and to be able to see that end game where we knew that patients were being cared for and being cared for wonderfully in such a phenomenal building was such a rewarding experience. Facility and design process, about 6-8 weeks before the project, we decided as an organization that we're going to bring everybody through one more time. Let's take a look, make sure that the building is, the workflow, the plan, the departmental layout is really going to work, again, with a focus on that patient care. And of course, there were changes that came through last minute. And so, it was a lot of work, but it really addressed some issues that would have come up post-go live that you really didn't want to come up post-go live. So we're able to head off some of those post-go live changes. And again, talked about internally led procurement, identifying the stakeholders, et cetera. And that's really the key. We felt with our project to have supply chain as a key stakeholder on the project team. So those are the points. Of course, we ended up favorable to the entire FF&E budget, which was another huge plus. And again, it speaks to the teamwork, the transparency, the collaboration with internal and external stakeholders. I have to say that it was probably one of the hardest projects I've ever worked on, but it was also one of the most rewarding projects I've ever worked on.
And I'll tell you what, being a Chicago native here, the hard work that Mike and his fellow team members there has just been a tremendous asset for the city. It's a beautiful hospital. It's got incredible patient outcomes. Really good job here.
Yeah, and Edward's team was a huge part of that as well. So.
And for those who don't know it, it is the tallest children's hospital in the United States.
Wow,
Yep.
I believe it. Wait, I think 28 stories.
23 stories.
23.
And again, Edward, correct me if I'm wrong. You would know better, but I don't know. Is there another building that has a second floor ED?
I'm not aware of one, Mike. I know there's been some on a couple of other large-scale projects we're working on. There's been some dialogue about that. In fact, we've directed them to Lurie Children's for them to see that from an operations perspective. That concept works very well for Lurie Children's simply because you've got a 23-story, 1.25 million square foot building on a 1-acre lot. So and if you think about that, that's a very small parcel, and it's a very dense urban environment, and you have both clinical entry and supply chain entry opposite of each other from one street to the next, to fulfill the needs of the hospital. And so that's a very unique configuration from a healthcare standpoint. And yeah, I mean, I think it's quite innovative, and also, it represents its sets of challenges, but it's been very successful.
Well, and Edward, I go back to what you started out with. You've seen one hospital. So certainly the approach that worked for Lurie Children's worked phenomenally, but it's not a cookie-cutter approach that's going to work for others. Really, it's meant to just provide some guidelines as to here's what worked for us, but more so, raise questions. Have you considered this? Have you thought about what your procurement plan is? Have you thought about your strategy, et cetera? All of the topics that both you and I have touched on is really meant to just spur some thoughts around, okay, we're getting ready, or we're at this stage. I need to start thinking about these factors as well.
Right.
Well, gentlemen, I think that's actually a really nice way to wrap up there. Mike, thank you. I appreciate your expertise and your mentorship to me personally and professionally. Edward, I appreciate all the insight you have here. You've got a depth of knowledge there, and it's pretty clear that you're a subject matter expert on all of this. And I thank you for sharing that with our audience today.
You're welcome.
So again, thanks to the audience here for joining Open Markets, Covalus, and ARM today. We will send you all a brief survey after this, actually, if you don't mind giving us some feedback on what you learned and what we can do better, and also on some topics coming up that we might be able to produce some thought leadership on for you. And for your colleagues who are unable to make it, sometime in the next 24, 48 hours, we'll have a download available, and we'll make sure that all the audience here, both registered and attended, have a link to be able to download the webinar. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.